In this guide, you're going to learn how to set up Patrol in your Flutter project. We are starting with a new empty Flutter app that is as simple as it gets. And the first thing that we would like to do to set up Patrol is to actually add it to our pubspec YAML file. So we can either add it directly to dev dependencies by writing here, or we can open up console and run flutter pub add Patrol as a dev dependency. And here we have it as a dev dependency. We are not leaving pubspec YAML just yet because we also need to configure Patrol over here. In the written documentation, there is this bit of YAML config, which I'm going to paste here all the way down in this pubspec YAML file. So you just want to provide an app name and then Android package name and iOS and macOS bundle IDs. Now, in your case, your package name and bundle ID is probably not going to be com.example.myapp, but in the case of this guide, it is precisely that. So where can you find your package names? Well, for Android, you are just going to go to Android app build.gradle. Very simple to do even from within VS Code. And here, if you scroll a bit down into default config, you're going to see application ID. In my case, it's com.example.myapp. Now, for the iOS and macOS bundle IDs, you can technically get to it even from VS Code, but it's much simpler to do that by right-clicking on the iOS folder and opening an Xcode. And if you go to runner, target runner, and then make sure you are on the signing and capabilities page, you see the bundle identifier here, which is com.example.myapp. Now let me close this. And if I open up the macOS folder exactly again in Xcode, and I go to the exact same location, so runner, target runner, and sign-in and capabilities, again, I see com.example.macos.myapp is the bundle identifier for the macOS app. To be able to run Patrol tests, you are going to need the Patrol CLI, so command line interface. So for that, of course, we need to open up our terminal and run dart pub global activate Patrol _ CLI. Now I already have it activated, so you will maybe see a bit of a different output here. And after a bit of time, it's going to be activated. To verify that this installation has been successful, we are going to run Patrol Doctor. Very much like Flutter Doctor, but this is Patrol Doctor. And we can see that we are good to go for Android, but for iOS/macOS there is one issue. So I'm actually going to run this command real quick. Now if I run the Patrol Doctor again, everything is nice and green. If this is your very first time that you are setting up some command line interface for Dart, you may not be able to even run Patrol like this. So make sure to check out the written documentation, the section for installing this Patrol CLI. In that section, you have a link to the Patrol CLI README that will teach you how to make Patrol available right from the terminal. This is all of the general setup that we need to do. And now we're going to move to the native side of setup. First up, we're going to focus on Android because it's a bit simpler to set up than iOS and macOS. So the first thing we want to do is to edit our main activity test.java file, which should be located under Android, app, src, and then Android test, which is not here. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to create that directory, and I'm going to be working purely from VS Code, but you can totally open up the Android folder in Android Studio and work from there if it's simpler for you. But I'm staying within VS Code. So within this src folder, I'm going to create Android test. Then in Android test will be Java folder. Within Java, I'm going to create folders following the package name. So in this case, it's going to be com example my app. So com, another folder example, another folder my app. This is the same folder hierarchy as is within the main folder, and then Kotlin. Again, here we have com example my app, and here we have Java com example my app as well. In your case, you want to follow your own package name here. And within this my app folder, we're gonna create main activity test.java. And from within the written documentation, we're going to copy the contents of this file. As you can see here, you should replace this package name with your own app's package name, but I don't need to do that since it's exactly this package name that my app is using. And then also you want to replace this main activity.class if you're using native embedding, but we're not, so we can just leave it as is. Now inside the build.gradle file, which is right here inside of the app folder, we want to find the default config section. So right here, default config, and we're going to copy 2 lines from the written documentation and paste them here. Then another bit of code we want to copy from the written documentation will go into the Android section. So right here, below default config, even below build types, we're going to paste this test options section. And to dependencies, which are all the way down here, we're going to add the Android test util. And this is it for the Android setup. If we were to focus only on Android, we could run our first patrol tests even now. But since we also want to support the iOS and macOS platforms, let's continue with their particular native setup. While we could set up Android without any hassle right from within VS Code, to set up iOS and macOS, we're going to do that from within Xcode. So right click on iOS first and open in Xcode. Unfortunately, it's not possible to make this UI larger, so make sure you're watching on a large screen. The first thing we want to do is to create a test target for runner UI tests. Currently, we only have target for runner tests, but we want to have runner UI tests. So we're going to go to File, New, Target, search for UI testing bundle, just like this. Click Next. The product name should be Runner UI Tests. The organization identifier should be basically the bundle ID. So in this case, it's com.example.myapp. Language is Objective-C. Make sure it's selected. Project is Runner and target to be tested is Runner. Click Finish. Now we have this folder on the side, Runner UI Tests, containing 2 files, Runner UI Tests and also Runner UI Tests Launch Tests. We want to right click on this Launch Tests file and delete it and move to trash. Now if we click again on Runner UI Tests and Build Settings, we want to search for iOS deployment target. And in this case, for Runner UI Tests, it's iOS 17.2. the minimum is 11, but it should be exactly the same as for runner itself. And here you can see that iOS deployment target is iOS 12 for the runner. So we want to make it also 12 for runner UI tests, just like this. We want those two versions to be the same. As for the contents of this runner UI tests file, we want to replace them by the code from the written documentation. We also want to edit the pod file now, but that is not really possible from within Xcode. So we're going to jump back to VS Code for a bit, open up the iOS folder, pod file all the way down, and inside target runner, right here, where it says target runner do, all the way down, right before the last end, we want to copy the code from the written docs. We're still staying within VS Code now because we want to create a new folder within the root of our project called integration test. And inside of there, create an empty file example_test.dart. So no code is going in here just yet. And now I'm going to copy a command from the written documentation and run it in the terminal. So that is flutter build iOS config only, and then the path to the integration test / example test.dart. Wonderful. For me, it worked perfectly. If you get some sort of errors, make sure to resolve them before continuing any further. Now we're gonna go inside of our iOS directory, so cd iOS, and inside iOS we're gonna run pod install repo update, just like this. Okay, I did get some warnings, but warnings are not errors, so it's fine, and we can see that pod installation is complete, which is precisely what we wanted, so we're good here. If you get some real errors and not just warnings, make sure to resolve them before continuing. Now let's go back into Xcode. Since we have updated it from our command line, we want to use version on disk to use the new version of the project. Let's click on runner again, project runner, remove the iOS filter from here and go to info. And here we have three configurations: debug, release, and profile. For each of these three configurations, we want to make sure that the runner UI test configuration matches exactly the configuration of the runner. So for debug, we can see that runner is set to debug. Runner UI test currently is set to some pods, runner, and so on, which is what we don't want. So let's change it to just debug. See, we want to have the runner UI tests precisely matching the config of runner. The same goes for release. Here, runner is set to release, so runner UI tests will be also set to release. And lastly, for profile, it's set to release for the runner, so runner UI tests, again, is going to be set to release. Now that all of these are matching, we want to click on runner UI tests, build phases, and click on this plus icon and add a new run script phase. Click on this run script, name the first one Xcode _backend build. You can also copy these names from the written documentation. The second one will be new run script phase called Xcode _backend embed and thin. You want to make sure that they are arranged as follows. The Xcode backend build, just drag it to be under this cp checkpods manifest.log. So it should be right under it. And the other script phase, the Xcode backend embed and thin, should stay at the very end. Now, if we open up the Xcode backend build, we can see that we can paste the script in here. And let's paste the script from the written documentation and also paste the appropriate code into the Xcode backend embed and thin. Another thing you want to do is to disable parallel execution for all schemes. The way you can do that is by going up here to this runner, right here, just clicking it, edit scheme, then clicking options here for runner UI tests, so options, and disable execute in parallel. So make sure it's not ticked. Then you can hit close. And the very last step for iOS is to go to runner UI tests, build settings. Let's filter for user script sandboxing, and we want to set it to no. That's it for iOS. Now we can run patrol tests on Android and also on iOS. If you want to run your patrol tests also for the macOS platform, you of course also need to set up that platform. I am not going to cover it in this video guide because the steps for setting up macOS are practically speaking the same as for setting up iOS. You just don't do them in the iOS project, to which you can get by right-clicking on iOS and opening in Xcode, but instead you are gonna do it inside of the macOS project. So you wanna right-click this macOS folder in VS Code and open in Xcode this macOS folder. But the steps are pretty much the same with a bit of change here and there. So if you read through the written documentation for the macOS setup, you're going to feel right at home because the things you're gonna be doing in Xcode are basically the same steps that you have done a couple minutes ago for iOS. Now, following the written documentation, we are going to create a very simple example test. So right within this example test file, which is now empty, we're gonna paste this code from the written docs. This tutorial is not covering how to write patrol tests. You can check out the other sections of the documentation to learn how to use patrol. We can now test out if patrol is set up properly by running this test. So let's open up the terminal, make sure that you are in the root of your Flutter project, and let's run the command from the written documentation, which is patrol test, and the target will be integration test/example test.dart. If your app is using flavors, you will want to specify a flavor here when you are running your patrol tests. You can do it like this, flavor, and then for example dev, if that's the name of your flavor. We are not using flavors, so of course I'm not gonna run this command like this, but I would recommend you to check out the written documentation if you want to learn more about how patrol works with flavors in general. Now, I have already launched an iPhone simulator here, so let's just run it on that. And since iPhone simulator is the only one running, it's going to automatically choose that as the device. The app is now gonna get built just like usual, and it's going to run on this iPhone simulator. And here we go. The app is running finally, and the testing was successful. This way, we know that we have set up patrol properly. And you can also run the same thing on an Android emulator. And if you have set up macOS, even on the macOS platform. Just know that macOS is a bit limited in its functionality right now, so you're not going to get a one-to-one feature parity for macOS. If you have any questions or if you have experienced some error, make sure to check out the FAQ section in the written documentation, or also reach out to us on the Patrol Discord server. Take care.